Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us at the end of a very busy Friday here in Sacramento, when the governor unveiled his May budget revision. Over the next half hour, CSBA CEO and Executive Director Vernon Billy and CSBA's governmental relations staff will break down the May budget and what it means for public schools. After the main presentations, there will be a question and answer session. In order to participate, please locate the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and submit your questions via that icon, not the chat icon. Again, please submit your questions through the Q&A module. Staff will be answering those as we go along, and the questions that we don't get to during the course of the presentation, we will field during the question and answer session at the end of this webinar, time permitting. Again, thanks for joining us. Now I will introduce today's presenters. As mentioned previously, CEO and Executive Director Vernon M. Billy, the head of our governmental relations team, Dennis Myers, two of our legislative advocates, Erica Hoffman and Cheryl E. Day, and I'm Troy Flint, the moderator for today's event. And now I will turn you over to our CEO and Executive Director, Vernon Billy.
Thank you, Troy. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending CSBA's May Revised webinar, where CSBA staff will do a deep dive into the governor's May revision. There's a lot to dig through the governor's whopping $300 billion state spending plan, which includes a $97.5 billion surplus, and it's absolutely incredible. My comments today are intended to set the context for the work of CSBA and the detail you'll hear from today's panelists. You know, throughout the budget season, CSBA has advocated for the resources needed to support our district and county office members as you work to improve our schools. The fruits of our labor are visible in the May Revise, particularly in the form of higher base funding for Lcff and a Covit ADA relief funding. I'm proud to say that CSBA, working with our partners like ATSA, led the charge on these issues, even when they were initially met with skepticism by some in the Capitol. Despite this rough reception we initially received, we persevered because we know this is a time of tremendous need for local school districts and county offices of education. And while there were some programs and services that were neglected in the May Revise, such as pension relief and full funding for home to school transportation, we're not going to be deterred in our efforts to bring attention to these important services for students. These issues, particularly pension relief, for example, are critically important. LEAs are facing rate increases of more than 2% in CalSTRS and CalPERS. That equates to a single year pension cost increase of well over $1 billion starting July 1. This leap in employer contributions will dilute the value of the increased Lcff base funding. And the panel is going to talk a little bit more about that, but I think it's very important to understand that. And lastly, I do want to mention that CSBA has and will continue to fiercely advocate for full funding of home to school transportation. By failing to fully reimburse transportation costs and provide schools a cost of living adjustment, the state has steadily forced local educational agencies to eliminate or divert funds from other essential student programs to offer transportation. We just think that's unconscionable. And as I like to say, the state's horse and buggy level of funding for school transportation may have worked in 1822, but it doesn't work in 2022. The state needs to do more to support school transportation. Regardless, we will continue to be hopeful about the prospects of AB 2933, which is the CSBA-sponsored bill that would reimburse schools 100% for school transportation costs. So we encourage you to support this bill as well. With that, I'll wrap up by saying thank you again for joining us today and for being the elected and appointed education warriors that make our public schools shine. Dennis, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Vernon. And if I start chuckling here, I'm going to chuckle at your horse and buggy reference to home to school transportation, because that's about the last time that program got an increase. So thanks for that reference. All right, let's take kind of a high level look at Proposition 98. As you're adopting your budgets, you're not going to be thinking about Proposition 98 being $100 billion. Kind of just to boil this down in one sentence is there's a lot of money available. The top here, we just referenced the current year budget amount for Prop 98 is 83.4 billion. Okay, that's what's in the current year budget. Now, as we look into the May revision and compare it to the January budget, that's where we start talking about these really huge amounts of money. So you can see here, the bullets here, the differences between the January budget, the K-12 share of that between the January budget now is like $7+ billion. But as you look at, the total increase, Prop 98, when the governor looks at the January budget, when the governor comes into the May revision, they're always looking back a year, looking at the current year, and then looking out into the next fiscal year. So over those 3 years, the increase is, a little more than 19 billion. And that's where you get all these ongoing money, one-time monies, things like that. So just to let you know, you're going to hear numbers like that as we go through these slides and as you read press reports, all the various press that's coming out today and then tonight and over the week, you'll see we're talking about some really large increases. Now, let's focus in on this third bullet, because you're all probably looking at this third bullet saying, I'm not getting that amount. We know that. We even debated at the staff level of whether or not to include this bullet. But the fact is you're going to hear from the administration that this budget provides $22,850 per pupil. What that means is there is everything in there is included. Federal funding, bond funds, local bond funds. The money that the governor contributed as he's walking down the street to a local PTA. Everything is in there, and that number is a very high number. Is it your number? No, it's not even really a number that we use at CSBA. The second number you're going to hear then is, well, Prop 98 then is almost $17,000. Again, that is an average number. It includes a lot of things within. It's not just like Lcff. This is everything within Prop 98. So no, it's not your number. Your number is going to differ based on where you are with Lcff. Your home to school transportation historical figure, dating back to the horse and buggy. That's why we were a little bit nervous about putting this in here, but since you're going to see it, we need you to be able to know that, okay, those aren't real numbers, and you could tell your public that, because people may come to your board meetings saying, hey, I heard you're getting $20,000 a student. You need to be able to explain that. Just then going down to this bottom, as we've talked about the last few years, Prop 98 remains in test 1 for the current year, and then through the projection period out a few years. What that means is that Prop 98 K-14 gets a specific percentage of the state general fund. And that's because the state general fund growth is outpacing inflation, and it's actually outpacing enrollment, because enrollment is actually dropping. So because of those two factors, we're not moving into test 2, we're staying in test 1. Next slide, please. So transitional kindergarten, as you know, we've been talking about this for a while. The adopted budget, the January budget as well, talking about this rollout now of transitional kindergarten to all 4-year-olds. One of the battles that we did win as CSBA early on was to make sure that as this rollout happens, since we're bringing new students into the guarantee, the Proposition 98 was going to be rebenched up, as opposed to just keeping it flat and then putting less per pupil. We're actually recognizing there's more students. And so the state agreed to rebench Proposition 98. You're going to hear about how this is changing a little bit. These numbers are dropping mainly because enrollment numbers are different, inflation is different. So this rebenching number looks like it's going down, but it really is just the current math working to on what rebenching will look like because of the increased students under transitional kindergarten. So this isn't bad, this is good. This is just the state keeping its commitment. And we have better numbers today than we had in January. And so that's why, this is news. And you may hear some people talking about this rebenching going down. It's just the math, nothing to worry about. All right, next slide, please. So let's look at the COLA. What's always interesting is we heard this in the January budget about, record numbers of COLA. So that's what this second bullet is about. In January, the budget, the COLA was 5.33%. And people were like, at the Capitol patting themselves on the back about record levels. Well, guess what? The COLA for the May revision is even bigger than that at 6.56%. Again, people are patting themselves on the back. Record COLA, never before seen in the history. It's just statute. Some of you are going, well, wait a minute. I just heard, inflation is like 8%. That's what we're saying too, right? So the factors that drive COLA and the statute that is in place, it's always a quarter or two behind. So yes, inflation right now in May is tracking at 8 point something percent. So this is tracking a little bit behind that. So while this is good news that it's more than 5.33% from January, it's not your current level inflation. So that's work that we're going to have to do when we look at the investment in LCFF. So just so that you know that's very important. The COLA applies to LCFF, and the COLA also applies to those programs. If you recall from January, the governor's talking about cost of living increase for specified categorical programs. That was the term used today as well. So what that means is the programs that were proposed for COLA in January are the programs that this higher COLA would apply to. So we listed those there for you. The big ones obviously are special education, child nutrition, adult ed block grant, and the mandate block grant. Those are key, and we're certainly glad that those are in there. The ones that it doesn't apply to are smaller programs, but still important, like career tech. That doesn't get a COLA. So again, more work that we have to do between now and finalization of the budget, but at least there is a recognition by the governor of statutory COLA, which is important, and the fact that some of these other real critical programs need a cost of living increase as well. Next slide. LCFF base increase. So we just talked about COLA, which yes, it's an increase to LCFF, but it's statutory. So as we have been talking about for a couple of years in that now about the need to increase base funding. We know that many folks have been talking about that. The governor is proposing money above the LCFF COLA to put into the LCFF base. This is a major, major development. And here's why. If you've been tracking the news over the past couple of months, there has been a proposal on the Assembly Democratic side with Assemblymember Teen coming out with a bill, AB 1948, that talked about, well, let's take the LCFF by like 15%. The Senate Democrats came out with a proposal, a kind of a 2-year proposal rollout to invest more in LCFF. Who was silent during that period of time was the governor. Well, today the governor came out and said, all right, statutory COLA plus another $2.1 billion. So that is good news. That $2.1 billion is about 3%, maybe 3.1, maybe 3.2 into LCFF. So those are real numbers. Those are significant. It's less than what the Senate and the Assembly are talking about. So you can see that's kind of the bottom line number now. Senate and Assembly have a higher number. So this is an area of negotiation. And when you look at all the money that's available under Prop 98, the governor's counting some as ongoing, some as one time, and you'll see this as we talk about other programs that are coming up here in a minute. There are ways to shift money to increase this number, but the good news today, and it's a good news for us as CSBA, we've been talking about this for a couple of years now about increasing beyond just COLA. And a lot of folks have started talking about it, but this is important. Now the governor is on record as wanting to do more than just COLA. That is significant. The other thing, and this was a very important part of our advocacy at CSBA, is when you look at the Senate proposal and the Assembly proposal, they don't have anything in there for county offices of education. So we've been talking on the Senate and Assembly side and with the administration about the need to make sure that when we talk about LCFF increase and COLAs and stuff, we talk about county offices of education. Governor today talked about $100 million plus for county offices of education for their LCFF. And we'll have more details on that as we're getting the trailable language that's coming out later today, but that is for county offices of education on their LCFF. So that's good news as well, and something that we have been pushing hard here at CSBA. Next slide. All right, this thing. So this is the reserve cap. The description today is very clear. We knew this in January. We knew this at the end of last year, is that the current level, the balance in this public school system stabilization account, we call it the Prop 98 reserve, is well over the amount needed to trigger the reserve cap. So the way that works is because the balance in the current year is now 9.5 billion, the trigger happens into this next fiscal year. So it's the year following the year that the requirements are met. So that just means, yes, the reserve cap hits July 1. It is something that you all should be talking about. It does not apply to small districts. We were able to exempt small districts when we had some clarifying language adopted into a bill that we had probably 5 years ago. Small district is 2,500 ADA and less. Basic aid districts also are exempted. We were successful in getting them exempted. So the other, probably 400 school districts out there, it does apply to, but it only applies to assigned and unassigned funds. You've heard us talking about this for a while. If you're still unclear on what that is, budget offices talk to your boards, boards talk to your budget offices to figure out, all right, if we're over the cap, how do we commit funds? How do we put funds into trust funds, things like that, to make sure that you're living within the rules here based on the cap, okay? So that's very important for you to know, but yes, it does trigger into this next fiscal year. Next slide. Next, we're going to go over to Cheryl Ide, and she's going to talk about some of the proposals in more depth that the governor made today in the May revision. Cheryl.
Thanks, Dennis. So this is the big win for CSBA. We worked in really tight partnership with AXA on this proposal, and we're calling it the COVID ADA relief. This was a complement to the governor's existing proposal back in January. It had to do with using a 3-year rolling average in order to combat declining enrollment. The big point that we were making is that due to the surges that we saw with Delta and Omicron that really devastated ADA in the current year, is that it's effectively like having 3 midterms where you get an A, and then a D. And so if we don't correct for current year, it throws off that entire 3-year rolling average proposal from the governor back in the fall. So we were very pleased to see that what the proposal that we brought forward in order to correct for this, which would be to take your 1920 88 percentage, most people have 95% or better, and that apply that to current year and your current year enrollment. So that therefore it's like getting an A, which you normally perform at, and not seeing a complete decimation of your 3-year rolling average, which has always been intended to help your declining enrollment. And so this was absorbed into the May revision proposal, and we're really happy to see that this was a big win for us. The next big thing that we see this year is that it's an $8 billion one-time block grant. So if you recall, back in 17-18 was the last time that we saw this back in the Brown administration, was that there significant amount of one-time funding that would go out based on a per ADA level. And that's exactly what this is going to be the same way. It was at that time, a lot of the conversation was going on was that it could be used for Common Core, other things of that matter, whatever some of the major priorities were at that time, but the funding was flexible. And so in response to a lot of the big talk that we've had about rising costs and operational costs and staffing, the proposal for May revision is to include an $8 billion one-time block grant. This is also going to offset the applicable mandates debt. This is again, the same thing that we saw in previous proposals. So if we have a mandate backlog at the state controller's office, any of that debt would be used to first remove or relieve that, and then everything moving forward, again, as all flexible. School nutrition. So as you recall, prior to the implementation of universal meals, the state provided about $54 million in ongoing Prop 98. With the introduction of universal meals, we saw $596 million ongoing proposed in the governor's budget. But in recognition of that was probably an insufficient amount, They're adding an additional about $612 million to augment this fund, bringing the total amount to about $1.4 billion. And then any of those funds that may not be used would go towards kitchen infrastructure. And so nice to see that there was some recognition from the field, myself included, for CSBA, that the 596 was not going to cut it, given the additional hours and staffing that would be needed to be able to implement universal meals and the challenges that it brought in a very short timeline. K through 12 facilities. So we're really happy to see an additional investment in K through 12 facility. It's about $4 billion overall. We saw a few proposals in the governor's budget back in January to provide some funding. And so there's been an additional augmentation to that, of which is over a 3-year proposal now. So we see, in addition to that, we see an additional $1.8 billion in 98 for one time. This is for deferred maintenance. As some of you may recall, back in 13-14, when we introduced Lcff, deferred maintenance was rolled into the larger general fund pot. And so that funding was absorbed in there. And so this is a return of that program and for the same uses for those funds. So my guess is that this was a way to be able to alleviate some of the concerns around GAN funding and exceeding the state appropriations limit. So at that point, you can count that towards not reducing the state appropriations limit. At the same time, it counts towards Proposition 98. So there's my guess there. But we're happy to see the funds. We're happy to see it go to deferred maintenance because we know that that has been a long ongoing issue. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Erica, to talk about community schools.
Okay, I have to get all the buttons turned on. Good afternoon, everybody. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about community schools. As you know, this was a proposal that was put forward last year. The governor provided $3 billion, and it was to be available over several years to expand and to strengthen community schools. However, once the Department of Education kind of let the application process out, the demand has just skyrocketed for funding on this. The department was saying they've received a little over $700 million in applications to implement community schools. They originally had $400 million available. So I mean, the demand is quickly outpacing. So the governor is proposing to include an additional $1.5 billion in one-time funds to expand access to meet that need, so that more schools can start to either plan for or to implement and expand current programs they already have and for the community schools. The next slide, please. The Expanded Learning Opportunities Program. As you know, the governor provided $1 billion in last year's budget from ongoing Prop 98 funds for the ELOP program, the Expanded Learning Program. And it was supposed to basically kind of just kickstart this program, get it off the ground, wouldn't be fully implemented until like 25, 26. Well, in January, the governor proposed an additional $3.4 billion in funding to just kind of totally ramp this program up. Because of what they're seeing in the field, the need for services for students, the May revision would allocate an additional $403 million for a total of $4.8 billion in ongoing funds for this program for the 22-23 school year and on. One of the pieces that has been talked about a lot is the need students have for art and music and all those courses that, you know, over time, as we've gone through the pandemic, just haven't really quite been available to students. So the governor did propose funding in his January budget and one-time funds for art and music grants. And in the May revision, he's proposing to increase that by an additional $63 million for a total of $1 billion in one-time funds to get the art and music program piece started in this under the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program. And if you can go to the next slide, please. A couple of more programs here that he is proposing. The Community Engagement Initiative. This is something that goes back to 2018 budget. And it was started with one-time funds. It's a program that's run through the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, CCEE, as many of you know it by. And basically what this program does is disseminates best practices for schools and community engagement and interaction and how to get that started and how to continue it. I mean, the one thing the pandemic has kind of shown all of us is that there is a further need to strengthen those relationships between schools and their communities, and in providing, a variety of services between what we've done for universal meals, what we've done in expanding healthcare, looking at the mental health pieces, all of that. But to basically make sure that we've got that engagement working between schools and communities. I mean, a piece of the local control or your accountability plan, what's kind of coming out of the federal government, is to have those connections. So the May revision would provide an additional $100 million in one-time funds to expand the program. They're hoping that this could at least cover at least 100 more districts, we hope. Maybe a couple thousand more schools, to be able to align their work and to build those community connections. And also, frankly, this does tie into the expansion of community schools. So you're kind of seeing a theme here where it's connecting all of these pieces together. The next slide, please. One piece that has come up over the last number of years, and it's something that we're facing tremendously now, is workforce development. The 2021 budget provided quite a bit of money spread out over many programs to help increase recruitment, retention, professional development for teachers. The governor's January budget provided a smaller increase, about $52.2 million, mostly to look at the extending teacher examination and credentialing fees to backfill CTC for their losses, because a lot of those fees basically have been suspended. The May revision would look further at kind of expanding a number of these programs, providing temporary authority to LEAs to allow teachers with preschool teaching permits who have undergraduate degrees and have passed the CBEST and are enrolled in coursework that leads to a full credential to serve as TK teachers. So this is kind of a new thought, a new look. Haven't seen the language on this. This will be part of the trailer bill language that's released later today. But it's kind of looking to provide some flexibility for those that currently teach preschool that are looking to maybe move up into teaching TK and providing them with an opportunity to do that as long as they are enrolled in credentialing courses. So that's one piece of it. Another piece is he's looking to provide $500 million in Proposition 98 money to expand residency slots for teachers and for school counselors, which is a nice thing to see in that it's putting an additional piece of importance on the need for school counselors. And then he would also expand the eligibility for the Golden State Teacher Grant programs to include school counselors, social workers, those that are going for your PPS credentials, your pupil services, psychological credentials. So I mean, it's to try to get those that are doing the pupil services pieces and credentials, getting them together, as we've seen over the last couple of years with the impact of the pandemic and just the need for counselors for students to address the mental health needs of students and the mental health needs, frankly, of your current staff, that the pipeline is thinner, or I think, and I honestly believe it's thinner than the teacher credentialing pipeline. So this is to try to get more people involved in that. He includes within his proposed May revision, $85 million in one-time funds from Proposition 98, basically for further resources for professional development, for the implementation of the next generation science standards, the math framework issues, the computer science standards that are come out. And then you've also got the math and science names of the preschool learning foundations that are coming forward as we look to expand preschool programs. So trying to provide a little more funding there so that we can get that training to teachers. And finally, under the workforce development side of things, he would include $300 million in one-time 98 funds for the Educator Effectiveness Block Grant, with an emphasis on STEM teacher supports and trying to continue to build up the math and science supports for teachers. Next slide, please. Now we kind of get into, I mean, some smaller programs, but these are increases that are new that he is providing within his May revision proposal. The governor would look to increase the classified school employee summer assistance program with $80 million in ongoing Prop 98 funding. He's also looking to increase the funding for the infrastructure for the expanded learning opportunities program for a total of $1 billion. It would be a $63 million one-time increase, but a total overall of $1 billion to support infrastructure for the ELOP program. And this is more of the specifics on integrating art and music. As Dennis had specifically talked about, a categorical COLA. It's an increase of about $62.1 million in Prop 98 general fund to reach the 6.56 COLA. And so that, you know, that one does apply to special ed and you know, the other programs that Dennis mentioned. The next slide, please. Accelerated reading support. This is something that the governor's come forward with, and it's to provide an increase of $15 million in one-time funds to support teachers completing the necessary coursework for supplementary state certification in reading and literacy. And this ties to the whole push that we've seen both here in California and at a national level of ensuring that kids can read by grade 3. Finally, we go on to the Center for Teaching Careers. He looks to increase the funding for that to support and expand the work that's being done up in Tulare County, or I should say not up there, but it's a statewide issue, but being done by the Tulare County Office of Education to support educator recruitment work. And then finally, he is providing some additional funding, new funding for the California School for the Deaf in Riverside for the athletic complex. One of the things that, if you've ever been to these schools, I mean, they're fabulous programs for both deaf, hard of hearing, and then we've also got the School for the Blind up in Fremont too. But a lot of their facilities are really old. And so he's just providing some to update all the outdoor sports fields. The last time the Riverside School saw any updates to their sports field was when the school was built back in the late 40s, early 50s, I believe. But now I will return it to Cheryl and Dennis to kind of talk about some of the last remaining issues within the budget.
Thanks, Erica. So there's a couple things, or there's a few things, and then we'll also get to some of your questions and concerns, because I think that you're bringing them up that we could add to the unresolved issues. One of which is transportation. So as many of you know, we have AB 2933, which is a bill by Assemblymember O'Donnell that CSBA is sponsoring to try to be able to get more funds for transportation. This wasn't part of the May revision. However, I will let you know that the Senate has already signaled that it's going to be a priority for them to get transportation funds. And we know that there's another bill out there, SB 878, which is also looking to be able to receive transportation funds a lot differently than which AB 2933, our sponsored bill, is looking to do. That bill includes a mandate as well as some pretty strict criteria, or more restrictive criteria, as it relates to bus drivers. And so we are still pushing through and pushing forward to be able to see some funds for transportation. And that's going to be a big part of our push moving on from this part. Another big thing that we didn't see there is pensions. While there was a lot of talk about being able to retain staff and being able to accommodate for increased costs, what we like and what we saw beginning at the end of this administration was pension buy downs with Proposition 98 general fund on behalf of school districts. And so without doing anything on the non-98 side, what we're going to see is about a $1.2 billion increase in pensions. And so while we see a lot of these funds going out and additional funds, and percentage wise, that's going to take a pretty substantial 2% off the top of that. So we really want to push and continue to push for getting a non-98 pension relief. We do have a budget ask on both the Senate and the Assembly side to be able to make this a priority. And so hopefully we can continue to move forward with that and make sure that we will continue to move forward with that and make sure that we can see something and make it be part of the conversation. Transitional kindergarten facilities. We did see a substantial amount of facilities, but that was for the core school facilities program. That's for new construction and modernization, of which already has a multi-billion-dollar backlog list of people that are already waiting in line for those funds. However, transitional kindergarten facilities are markedly different. And so without providing additional funds to be able to compensate for this policy goal that we saw last year, it's going to make it incredibly difficult to implement. And so we will continue to advocate for more funding specifically for transitional kindergarten and not make sure that it's going to go out to two other priorities, including full day kindergarten and preschool facilities. We want dedicated funds for transitional kindergarten because this is a priority of the state. Let's make sure that we can house those kids. Dennis?
Sure. I wanted to zero in on probably all these issues, but really school pensions, because when we were just right before coming on to this, there was a discussion that we had with the Department of Finance. And in some of the discussion there's an indication that this money that would be in the base above COLA, when you get into some of the conversations, and I'm going to believe probably with even some of the legislators, they may be thinking, well, why do you need money for pensions when you're getting this massive increase to Lcff? So we really need to, in our advocacy, and you'll be hearing that from us in the coming days when we fine tune our understanding of this and get more messaging out, is to really talk about, well, listen, if you're giving an X amount increase to Lcff, you can take 2 points right off the top of that we're not able to invest into community schools, mental health, all the things that you want to keep doing, because that's an increase that we know is going to happen July 1 if the legislature and the governor don't put non-Prop 98 money toward the pension part. So those are things that I think that legislators and others might just start trying to think is solved, but we cannot let them get away with paying their debt with our money. That's really critical. And we'll message that for you over the next few days, so we can really start pounding away on that, as we have been for the last 6, 7, 8 months. But I think that's going to be part of any time we're asking, even for transportation money. Some legislators will go, you're getting everything in Lcff. We can't let them get away with it. So that'll be something that we really have to be pushing over the next 30 days or so. Any questions out there? Let's see. Now I'm going to look over at the Q&A screen to see if there's anything that we can address here.
Yeah, I would just say that staff has been doing a great job answering the questions directly in the Q&A. So I appreciate that. But I also think the group as a whole would benefit from lifting up some of those questions that have been submitted more frequently.
Sure.
And I think the question I've seen the most in the Q&A section relates to the TK facilities, which were just touched on, but specific to basic aid or community funded districts, there's distress over the fact that there's no allocation for them. Is there any hope of that happening, or what is the prospect there?
Well, it's part of the push. Is there any hope? It's a difficult, I think it's a difficult thing. And we've had this conversation with a lot of the basic aid districts, is there's a perception here in Sacramento that you're rich. And so, we have to really keep pressing on it. So the basic aid districts, community fund districts have to keep pressing. We're supportive of funding, TK funding, including facilities money going to basic aid districts, because you're all going to be, opening those programs up, to service your students, because, the non-community funded districts around you are going to be offering those programs. So yes, it's part of the advocacy. And it's a tough part of the advocacy. Cheryl, I thought I saw you were about to answer that too. Is there anything else on that issue?
No, I think you covered it. We continue to advocate for this year after year. We know that the rebench includes the ADA for those TK students that are in basic aid districts as well. But I was texting colleagues as those questions kept coming up, and they know, they're aware, and we're just going to have to keep pushing.
Yeah.
Thank you. There were also a couple questions about ADA, trying to get at what the most advantageous formula would be for most districts to calculate. And we also just had one request to review the ADA relief slide again. So Chris, if you could pull that ADA relief slide up once more so we could walk through it.
You know, when you look at, we had a couple of questions about, there were kind of LCFF base increase calculation on a per ADA basis. So those things, you know, you're all going to be funded differently based on your, you know, your unduplicated count, things like that. So that's a really difficult thing. We can't say, hey, the $2.1 billion increase that the governor's talking about is equal per ADA. We can't do that. If it's equal to about a 3% increase, then you can look at what your LCFF is and get a back of the envelope thought of, well, our LCFF is this. If it goes up by 3% above COLA, then it may mean this to us. I mean, those are the only ways that we could help you think about what this may be worth to you locally, but there's no way we can calculate that because everybody kind of has a different share of LCFF.
Sure. And Cheryl, I know you have a couple of great analogies for explaining the ADA relief approach here. If you could trot those out for the group.
Yeah, so there's two components to this proposal. One of which is the governor's 3-year rolling average, right? Which makes sure that you have an additional year to be able to roll average if you have declining enrollment. I think many people have declining enrollment, and so this is intended to help everyone. The thing is if you have one bad year, which most of us do in this COVID era, that's going to throw the whole average out. So the COVID ADA relief proposal is specifically targeted for current year relief, which means that you are able to perform at your attendance level that you normally perform at using 1920 and applying that to your current year enrollment. So to the extent that you had growth in your district, some districts had growth. There was a lot of movement in California during the past few years. And so if you had growth during that hold harmless period, you would be able to be funded at what your current enrollment is, but you would calculate it based on what your 1920 ADA percentage yield is. Most people are at 95% or better. So it's 95% of whatever your current year enrollment is. And that's really helpful towards the larger proposal that the governor proposed with the 3-year rolling average. One bad year throws the whole average off. So we're trying to swap out that bad year so that we can put a year in or put it in an 88 percentage in for the year that we normally perform at. That's what the intent is to do.
And
Does that
Cheryl,
make sense?
there were a few questions regarding charter schools and whether this ADA relief will also.
Yeah. So the 3-year rolling average specifically is for districts. It does not include charter schools. So that was a clarified question that we asked just maybe an hour ago with the Department of Finance. But the COVID ADA relief proposal, the CSBA AXA proposal is for everyone.
Thank you, Cheryl. So we have some new questions that are being submitted as we're talking. Each answer generates more questions. That's generally how this works. So one person wants to know how they can figure out on average, just the back of the envelope type calculation, what their individual districts can expect to receive. I assume they mean through the LCFF.
I can't speak to that. I think Dennis tried to answer that a little bit earlier as far as that, you know, everybody receives a different amount depending on what your supplemental and concentration grants are. So there's varying differences in that. And then everybody gets obviously a different amount based on if they are, you know, for their grades based on TK through 3 versus 4 to 6. You have different amounts in high school. So we can't do that at our level.
Okay. And then another viewer wants to know, how will ADA be calculated for the one-time block grant that will be distributed on a per ADA basis?
What was that question? I was typing something else.
Okay. We may need to clarify the question, but as it reads now, it says, how will ADA be calculated for the one-time block grant that will be distributed on a per ADA basis?
2021. So 2020, 21. So prior year, last year. So not current year, because current year is garbage, right? That's what we're trying to fix. 2021.
Right. And then just so everyone's on the same page regarding transitional kindergarten, will TK students be counted as part of the ADA
Yes.
calculation? And I see Dennis is in the chat answering this, but I'll save him a little type and we can do it verbally. Is there any change
Nope.
for the transportation add-on?
Nope.
That's been our fight. That's why we have AB 2933 is that was added because of our advocacy at the initiation of LCFF. We worked with CSBA on that to protect that program. And the answer was, let's just make it an add-on that we can forget. And they did, but we've never let them forget. We're always asking for COLA. We're always asking for growth. Now we have 2933. So, but right now that add-on is just an add-on, same dollar amount you got when we started LCFF.
And we had a couple questions about the funding increases, essentially wondering, are those permanent? Are they set in stone? Or could those ever get rolled back, maybe in a recessionary time or something like that?
Yeah, so they're permanent. You know, if you're concerned about recession, as you know, all of us usually are, the funding levels are permanent, but if revenues drop, then it creates in what the formula is called a maintenance factor, which means it's an IOU. I'll pay you back later. And when that gets paid back is when revenues increase again. So while it is an ongoing increase to LCFF, if revenues do drop, you still have that idea of what you should be getting paid, but it may not be paid to you in that year. So.
And then we have a question about the LCFF calculator, specifically when filling out the calculator, where do you put the 3% increase to the base?
Don't use it yet because we're not done with the budget process is what I would tell you. This is May revision. We still have the legislature's budget that we need to look at, and then they go and back and forth about what are the trade-offs. And so, I mean, I know people are being very great students and trying to get their homework done early, but this is, it's a little early to start calculating that right now. So I would just say, hold off.
I think the one thing you can count on is the higher COLA, because that's
Yes.
just a statutory number that's driven by, just by an index. That one put in, and the other stuff, you're just going to be speculating and playing around with numbers, and it's not going to be real until we get the actual budget signed.
I see a couple more questions in here about which enrollment ADA would be best for districts. I think we already addressed that. You can't have a universal response for that, but certainly if you work with your finance people or the people in your budget office, they'll be able to look at the attendance and enrollment numbers for your district and help you make that decision. We also talked about whether the 3-year rolling average applies to charter schools. And we have another question related to ADA. Is the 3-year average based on actual ADA or funded ADA due to hold harmless year?
Funded ADA.
Another question about when will the LCFF calculator be updated? Cheryl, I assume, as you just mentioned, the budget process is still ongoing, so it would be after that's complete.
Yeah.
So that will probably not be for at least another month or so, correct?
It depends on when he signs it. I mean, last year we didn't get a signed, we didn't get a signed budget until July 7th. So July 8th, Erica, you know what, around that time. It was way after the fact. Like,
Wasn't the 1st of July, let's put it that way.
yeah.
Okay.
Given the statutory requirement, we were not happy to see it a week and a half, week late.
So we could have potentially another 6 weeks before that's available. Just an estimate.
Well, we can hope for the best.
No,
And the ADA calculation, is that applied to current year or beginning fiscal 22-23?
Current year.
And then another question, would you be able to speak to the augmentation of approximately 3%? And would that be an ongoing boost to LCFF base or one time?
It's ongoing.
Is there additional funding proposed to cover the increased costs associated with reducing the TK students per adult ratio to 12-1 next year from its current level?
So I think that I think this is going to be, I'm going to try to answer this question the best way that I can. So that proposal already from governor's budget already included an additional amount for the TK class size reduction in there. And so what you see in May revision is an update to the numbers of what you would get per ADA, because the projections for ADA for TK was actually reduced with that class size reduction amount. That was already accounted for. So it's there. There was no amendment to it, or there were no reductions to it that I'm aware of.
We have another question about basic aid districts related to the ADA block grant. Will basic aid districts see any of that money?
The ADA block grant. What's the ADA block grant? Oh, the discretionary block grant. It's a good question. We'll have to get back to you on that one.
So we'll do some more research, ask some people, and provide a response, but thank you for that question. The next question is from a district that didn't report ADA in 2021, and they're wondering whether the one-time dollars being allocated be based on enrollment from 2021.
I'm trying to look at the question, Troy. We didn't report ADA in 2021, so will the one-time dollars be allocated on enrollment from 2021? It is my understanding that it's based on your 2021 numbers. So Erica, I feel like that question was answered when we asked Chris at finance.
You want it based, well, they're gonna be, my understanding is they're basing it on 2021 numbers, because 21, 22 numbers aren't gonna be good.
They're not final yet. And
Yeah, they're not
Yeah.
final, so, one of these, I think it'll be better explained once we get trailer bill language. We can actually see what's in the specific language, and we won't see that until later on this afternoon. So we can keep that in mind and hopefully get you guys an answer later on that one.
Next question, will the governor's 3-year average for ADA calculation also include the COVID ADA relief adjustment?
Yep. That was our big ask, and we got it.
Next is the one-time discretionary grant calculated on ADA or enrollment. It says per pupil, which I would expect is enrollment.
At this point, that's a good question. I think that's a trailer bill question. To me, it would.
It is a trailer bill question because
Because that's where it's going to be described as to what that means.
Mm-hmm.
And because right now, all we have are descriptor pages without any specifics.
Okay, so that's a TBD item for the moment.
You guys are getting really into the nuts and bolts of this stuff on here.
I know.
I know, people are getting
Good stuff.
nitty-gritty. That shows how focused they are on these issues. The next question is from someone who says, you mentioned that charter schools are not included in the 3-year rolling average, but the AXA proposal is for all. Isn't the AXA proposal to address the issue with the 3-year average? Thus, wouldn't that include charters? And please elaborate on how, if any, different AXA's proposal is from ours.
No,
I believe we worked on this together.
The proposal is a combined effort with AXA and myself, CSBA. So it is not, they're not two separate proposals. This is the proposal that we worked on together, hand in hand the whole entire time. It's the same proposal. So the AXA proposal and our proposal, our shared proposal, includes charter schools, but it's only for current year. The 3-year rolling average is the governor's proposal. That does not include charter schools. Does that make sense?
Yes. So just to repeat, AXA and CSBA are on the same page. We've been partners on this COVID ADA relief issue, which was a huge win for us in the governor's May revised budget. And so we are completely aligned on that and glad that we were able to get that victory. There's a question about, should we build the change in ADA into the budget? I assume meaning at the local level, should you assume that's a given and proceed with that idea as you plan your budget?
What change are we building in? The 3-year rolling average?
Yes, I assume that's what the question is referring to.
Well, it still needs to go through the process. So, this is a proposal, right? It still needs to go through the process, and we don't have anything final until the governor and the legislature come to agreement and a budget is signed. I think that's a part that I, especially with this administration, that I would, before you start doing anything in advance, remember things have changed after they've come together and had an agreement. Last minute things have changed and been held up. So that's the reason why we didn't get a signed budget until July, second week of July last year. So well, yeah.
I think
No.
Cheryl's comments reinforce a point that Dennis made in the chat, which is that you need to speculate conservatively. We know there's a disconnect between the timeline you're on to develop your budgets and when you're getting this information about the state level revenues. Also, layoff notice requirements are out of sync with the information that you need at the time you needed to do your local budgets. These are structural problems with the way California does school funding. We're well aware of this. It's a point that we make. So we're not ignorant of it, but unfortunately, that's unlikely to change in the short to medium term. So this is a system we're working with.
You know, in addition to that, Troy, I've been going back and forth on that issue with a couple of people in the Q&A. And, you know, what's been pointed out is, yes, you budget conservatively, but you do have the ability to adjust your budget past July 1. So, I mean, that's different as well. So there is that built in. What you can't do anymore is adjust on staffing. So this was the first year that you had to have your March 15th layoff notice applied to not only certificated, but classified as well. So that's one thing you can't adjust after March 15th, even though, you know, you adjust your numbers later on down the year. But yeah, there are ways that you can adjust your budget conservatively and then, you know, put money in different places contingent upon, and then you adjust it later. But yeah, I mean, you still have to do it. You still have to do it fairly conservatively, especially now that we don't really know what kind of increase we'll see in Lcff or, you know, some of this one-time money as well. So you just still have to kind of proceed cautiously and watch the news, watch our emails and stuff from AXA and others, just to keep up to date on what's going on.
Thanks, Dennis. The next question is about substitute teaching. Does funding for substitute teaching percolate high enough to be a component of the May revise? And also, after we answer that question, if we could just go beyond and talk about the teacher shortage issue and anything that's happening in the legislature or was in the May revise to address that topic.
Well, the rates for substitute teachers, those are decided locally, and those are part of a local budget. You know, frankly, even for some districts, they've been able to change some of their requirements of who they'll bring on as a substitute teacher. So a lot of that is more of a local issue versus a state level issue. But, you know, this all does tie to the teacher shortage we've had and the push that both the governor, the legislature, and we've all been looking for to get more people into the pipeline and get them, you know, hopefully and eventually hired as full-time teachers within school districts. I mean, I think as we're coming out of the pandemic, as we look at the amount of money that's being provided, the programs that are being funded, districts will now start being able to look at how do we expand and hire back those we've either had to lay off or expand programs and hire new people to come in to meet the needs. But as always, I mean, when you start looking at teacher shortage numbers, it's math, science, CTE teachers, special ed teachers are the big shortage areas we do have. And those, I mean, I think those have been the four shortage, or I should say the four largest shortage areas in the many decades that I've been doing this work. And then, you know, right now we add on top of that shortages in counselors, school psychologists, social workers in school sites as we try to address, you know, the mental health issues of both students and our staff. So the specifics of a substitute, to kind of go back to that a lot of that is more of a local issue. But, you know, it can play havoc with the local district budget, depending upon the numbers of teachers and number of substitutes you have to hire because of the impact of COVID and a variety of things in local districts. So.
Okay.
Hey, you know, Trey, I see this question here about nobody reporting ADA in 2021. So how does that work with what Cheryl's been talking about on this COVID relief effort? Well, the hold harmless that we've been living under for 3 fiscal years, which ends this year, is based on February 2020 number. That included an attendance percentage. And so that's what we're talking about, like looking at your current year enrollment. Then you have to multiply it by some attendance level. If you use the current year attendance, you're going to get hit with like a 10, 15, 18% hit because of the Omicron and Delta variants. So going back to that attendance percentage that you used in February of 2020 is what you bring that into the math, multiplied times enrollment, to get a better view and kind of a more hold harmless view. It'll still recognize you if you're declining in enrollment, but will protect you from that hit on attendance that you all took December, January, February. And so that's how that works. And that's what what the reference is to 1920. Did I cover that okay, Cheryl? I mean, sometimes it's easy to explain. This one, it gets a little complicated.
Yeah, you did. You got it.
I can go back real briefly to the substitute question. I just heard this from another one of our advocates. There is legislation currently right now before the legislature, AB 1895, that would provide funding to support LEAs in the recruitment of substitutes. So there is potentially some legislation there. At this point in time, whether that gets approved or not will be up to the legislature. Most likely, it's also going to be one of those questions that will be talked about and discussed as they go through the budget process, since this would need some sort of appropriation to it. So, I mean, there is at least a piece of legislation out there. CSBA is supporting it, and it's going to take probably a little bit longer than the 1st of July to get that one resolved. So that will probably come up more toward the end of the legislative session.
The next question is about pensions, and while we're on that topic, I want to mention that we have an ongoing advocacy campaign, what we call our Phone to Action campaign. If you received an email from CSBA about that, it's to make a big push for pension relief. That was one of the topics, one of the main areas where we were advocating, where we didn't get the satisfaction we were seeking, but we are still going to continue and actually redouble our advocacy on that point for all the reasons Cheryl was making, in that not continuing that pension relief is effectively undermining the increases in Lcff funding and the COLA, basically clipping 2% off the top, which is a really big deal for our districts. So if you feel the same way, please take part in that campaign and let your legislators know that pension relief is critical for our schools, so those funds don't get diverted from the classroom and can be used to support our students directly. But to the specifics of the question, can PERS and STIRS retirees come back to work prior to the 6-month threshold?
Oh, that one.
That only goes for how far was that extended? That was part of an executive order that was extended.
It's part of an executive order that I think has been repealed.
Oh, I gotta check. Yeah, I don't know.
So that's another one we're going to have to add to our. We'll check and get back to you on.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for that question, and we will get back to you with a response. Cheryl's going to take the answer to this next question, which says, for the COVID ADA relief proposal, we must have had declining enrollment over the last 3 years. That's a question. Or since Seabed's day, what would qualify as declining enrollment is essentially what the person is asking.
Okay, so for the COVID, I think we have to separate the two, right? Because we're conflating the two. They're two different proposals. COVID ADA relief only deals with current year, so only for 21-22. The 3-year rolling average, the governor's budget proposal. So those are two different things, but they complement each other. But our proposal is just for the current year. That's COVID ADA relief. So I answered that. So for declining enrollment, if you don't have declining enrollment, awesome. And you're in great shape. If you're a growing district, awesome. Great job. The proposal for a 3-year rolling average, governor's proposal, would actually be helpful for you, because if your district is growing, then you can use the current year or prior years and roll it together. But if you're a growing district, you're going to want to use the current year. So it's helpful either way.
Thank you, Cheryl. We have a question basically related to how do we get a budget that does even more to recognize the increased costs that schools are seeing, as well as the needs of students? Says, I know the governor and legislators will be congratulating themselves for this budget, but what I'm seeing is a COLA that doesn't cover inflation and an increase to the base that is going to be sucked up by pension increases. Won't we still be falling behind? How do we make this better?
Well, I think, okay, so I recognize your and appreciate your candor and see what you're going there. Love it. But I will say, and I will give them credit, that statutory COLA is not determined based on whatever the cost of inflation is. They're two different numbers. And so, we don't like it, but it's a bit out of their control because it's based on what the statute is. And that's the reason why we're seeing these additional funds. The pension piece is the piece that we're going to continue to fight for, because the amount that we see above is still higher than what our actual costs are. So we'll give them credit for that, because I don't want to be too hard on them, just because I do appreciate and do recognize that we do have an $8 billion discretionary amount of one-time funding, which we've been fighting for this for a very long time. I know that you've heard me say this multiple times, that we don't like all these competitive block grants and we don't like all of this additional categoricals. And so 8 billion in discretionary funds, that's a huge, huge win for us, instead of a bunch of little more pieces of competitive funding that we're going to have to go after. So I wouldn't say that our heads were still underwater, because I think that they are trying to account for that. I do not like that they're using Prop 98 by giving us more money to be able to buy down pensions. I think that still should remain outside of Prop 98, and that's what we're going to fight for, so that 2% doesn't get eaten up with 98. It instead allows for you to have more discretionary funds to do with what you need to build out programs for staffing up and whatever your locally determined needs are. So I get where you're going, but I think that we're actually in a good spot this year so far.
Okay. The next few questions are going back to this ADA relief issue and attendance. It seems that people are still grappling with this. I have to say grappling because Dennis hates that word, so I got to get it in at least once every time we do these things. But the first question is, when we talk about attendance percentage, are we dividing our 1920 P2 ADA by our 1920 Fall 1 enrollment?
No, your attendance percentage is based on whatever it's your ADA. So it's whatever your, however many, if you had 100 kids in your district, but on average only 95 showed up, you get so you have a 95% attendance rate. It's applying that rate to your 100 kids total, and that's how you're funded. So I hope that answers the question. So we're not doing any division of P1 or P2 or any of that for the proposal.
Okay, and back to base funding. Let's say the base goes up 3%. This person is asking whether supplemental and concentration grants will also increase based on that bump in the base. And then there's a second part. Okay, that's an easy answer. The second part of the question, was there any discussion around how to get families to sign up? I assume he means for the forms to validate as low income or qualifying for supplemental and concentration grants. He mentioned that they're on duplicated count, created when food became free. So has there been conversation around that issue?
Yes, there's been lots of conversation about this. And it's only become much more of a conversation due to the bill that some of you might be aware of, AB 1948, and wanting to change that threshold for low income. And so this is an ongoing conversation. They're very much well aware of it, but because it's not just a state requirement, if you wanted to do the alternative minimum income form, which is required for Lcff, I don't think that form is actually any better than doing the free meals form, but they are aware that this continues to be an issue, but it's a federal requirement as well as an Lcff requirement. And so there's not a whole lot of ways around it, but what we're hearing from the field and part of these discussions that are ongoing is that by making these forms electronic, it's been a strategy that has worked for some districts to be able to make sure that they get that form back, because if you can't go to the next screen before you fill the information out, you can't complete the document. And so they're finding that more people, the take rate of completion is actually better when they include it in an electronic filled out form.
Thank you, Cheryl. The next question, oh, it just flashed off my screen. Dennis is so fast with his answers, but for the benefit of the whole, it concerned county offices of education and how some of them are not receiving COLA. And just in general, asking what can be done to advocate for more relief or recognition of the work that COEs do in terms of the funding they're receiving.
There's actually going to be a county proposal. It's my understanding, Erica. I don't know if we caught all the details on that.
I haven't seen any yet.
Yeah, it was noted to us in a briefing that we just got out of. And so I think that we're going to have to wait for trailer language to go through it. But it is my understanding that there's recognition that counties, even those that are fully funded, are continuing to have struggles with costs that are similar to district, which makes sense. And so there is a proposal for counties. We just haven't seen the language yet.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Hopefully that'll come out. Troy, if I could go back to a question that I answered a long time ago, but I realized there were 3 or 4 people that asked the same question. Back in January, the governor proposed $500 million increase in special education funding for the base grants under the AB 602 formula. That funding is still part of the budget proposal. All this, the May revision does is just now specify that they also get the 6.56% COLA. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear, that the increase in funding for the AB 602 formula for special ed is still part of the budget proposal going forward. And that didn't change under the May revision. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Erica. I also want to call people's attention to the chat where Dennis posted a link to the Pension Alert campaign. So if you didn't get that previous email that CSBA sent out, if you click that link, it will generate a super simple form you can complete in 1 minute, 90 seconds that will get your message to the legislators to let them know that pension relief is a big deal for schools and for students. We have another question here in the chat that mentions that most districts spend 80 to 90% of their funding on personnel, and stating that if the district didn't give raises that are the same as inflation, then their total expenses didn't go up by the same amount as inflation. They want to know if that premise is correct.
So I had answered that. That was Kimberly. So the answer really is we're not sure. I see why she's asking that, right? So if you got a 4% COLA and you gave a 3% pay increase, hey, maybe I'm ahead 1%. The answer is maybe. I understand the logic there, but it just depends on what other kinds of increases you had. Like, what was your liability insurance rates? How about fuel? You know, if you're a heavy transportation district and now you're paying $6 a gallon for diesel, all those other things you have to factor into, but you know, you just have to really think about how the rest of your budget was impacted by inflation and a COLA that didn't cover all of your inflation.
Great. So it seems that we have, oh no, one more question popped up. Is there a version of the advocacy letter that we can use to ask our community members to sign on to? So that's a good question. Some sort of petition or some sort of letter that various members in local communities can endorse that we can sign on to show the volume of support. That's certainly something we can get to work on, Diane. So thank you for that suggestion.
Yeah, and anytime we do an alert, you can forward that. I would be careful to forward it to a friend, someone you know who's not going to change it and advocate the other way. We've had that happen. So the link that we put into chat, since that's specific to pensions, if what this meant was, can we have a letter that maybe a mom and a dad could then forward? You know, you could forward that one. Also, we'll be doing more alerts over the next few weeks on more of these specific issues about transportation, about more, you know, about LCFF based things that are lacking here, that can be forwarded to. But that's a good question. Is we could probably do something more generic and get it out to you that you can just pass along and say, hey, can you sign on to this? That's a real, you know, snail mail kind of a letter.
Thanks for that explanation. And also thanks to the answer that Juan just provided in the chat regarding CalSTRS and CalPERS post-retirement earnings. That's very informative as well. With that, I think we got to almost every question. I see one question about, would we partner with PTA? We partner with them on a lot of issues. I don't know, we would have to discuss, but it's certainly a possibility whenever we have an opportunity to work with them. We do, because we understand the brand power of PTA with parents. And then, will this be available to watch again? Absolutely. On Monday, we'll be sending out an email that contains the slide deck that our presenters use, as well as a link to this recording, so you can watch it over and over again. Just binge watch our May Revised webinar, because it's just that type of stimulating material. I don't think there are any more questions, so I appreciate you all staying with us on a Friday afternoon. There will be many more communications coming out about the May Revise as we get further details and go through the budget process. But look for an email later this evening that has a more detailed breakdown of all the major components of the May Revise. Staff is working on that as we speak. And then, of course, like I mentioned, the follow-up email on Monday with this recording, as well as the slide deck presenters use. So thanks to staff, and especially thanks to everybody out there that took time to tune in. Best of luck with your budget process. You'll be hearing more from us soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.